It was Halloween, and a young man named Robert was driving home from work. Every house he passed was decorated with Halloween props like carved pumpkins, plastic skeletons, black paper bats, and witches on broomsticks. It reminded him of all the fun he had had as a child, going from house to house, trick-or-treating. Distracted by all the Halloween decorations, he missed his turnoff and had to take the long way back to his house. The light was beginning to grow dim, and the road was filled with twists and turns. As he came around a sharp corner, his car skidded on some loose gravel. He lost control, and his car slid off the road and plowed into a ditch. For a few minutes, Robert was dazed and just sat in his car, trying to regain his senses. After making sure he wasn't hurt, he got out and surveyed the damage. Apart from a few scratches, the car looked surprisingly fine. The problem was that the car was stuck in the ditch, and the rear wheels were raised a few inches from the ground. Being a rear-wheel drive car, there was no way getting out of this one. He would have to call a tow truck. Robert checked his pockets and discovered, to his dismay, that he had left his mobile phone at work. Now he was in the middle of nowhere, and he had to find a phone. He waited a few minutes, but when no car passed by, he decided to start walking. About a mile down the road, he finally spotted a house in the distance. When he came to the gates, there was an old, rusted truck sitting in the driveway. The door to the truck was wide open strangely, swinging in the breeze. There was nobody inside, so he continued up to the house. It was a dilapidated old building, and some of the shutters were hanging off of the windows. There was an eerie silence about the house. The only thing he could hear was the beating of his own heart and the low whistle of the cold October wind. Every now and then, a weather vane on the roof creaked as it swung around. Robert knocked on the front door a few times, but there was no answer. He was about to give up and try to find another house when he noticed something unusual. On the side of the house, there were some Halloween props and decorations. One of them was a rocking chair with a ragged scarecrow sitting in it. The scarecrow was wearing a skeleton mask, and as Robert got closer, he noticed it had a putrid smell. Stopping in his tracks, he stared at the scarecrow. Something didn't look right. Between the clumps of straw, he thought he saw something that looked like human skin. Filled with a strange mixture of fear and curiosity, he slowly reached out and pulled at the straw. It fell apart in his hand, and he was horrified to discover that beneath the straw there was a dead body. The skin was purple, and it was decomposing already. Robert was still trying to recover from the shock when he heard footsteps coming from the back of the house. "Who's there?" said a voice. An old man emerged from behind the house, and as soon as he spotted Robert, he started in surprise. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" he cried. Robert was trembling. There's a dead body." The old man rushed over and examined the scarecrow. Pulling at the straw, he revealed the disgusting face of an old woman. "Millie!" he shouted, his voice shaking. "Millie, what happened?" He turned to Robert, his eyes filling with tears. "Help me carry her into the house," he cried. Robert didn't know what to do. The man lifted her by the shoulders, and Robert picked up her feet. Together, they carried her up the front steps and into the house. They brought her into an empty room and laid her body on the cold wooden floor. "Stay here while I go get the police," the man shouted. Before Robert had a chance to reply, the old man was hurrying down the corridor. Robert stood there, still shaking, staring at the dead woman lying at his feet. After a while, he looked around and realized that there was no furniture in the house. It seemed completely bare, and it was covered with big cobwebs. There weren't even any good light bulbs in the fixtures. Robert waited and waited, but the old man never returned. After 20 minutes had passed, he decided to try to find the old man. As soon as he walked out into the corridor, he saw the phone. It was lying on the floor at the end of the corridor, and the line had been ripped out of the wall. With a growing sense of unease, he cautiously explored the rest of the house. There was no sign of the old man. Robert began to panic and ran out the back door. He didn't know where he was going, but he just kept running. After about half an hour, he came to a small general store that lay at the side of the road. Bursting into the shop, sweat pouring down his brow, he begged the shocked young woman behind the counter to call the police. She asked him what was wrong, but he was so out of breath that he couldn't answer. Exhausted from all the running, he sat down on the floor and tried to calm himself. When the police arrived, Robert told them what had happened. He got into the back of the patrol car and directed them back to the old dilapidated house. The police officers went into the house and spent 20 minutes searching it, top to bottom. But they didn't find anything. There was no dead body, no old man. The house had been vacant for years. The truck in the driveway had been abandoned almost a decade ago. Robert kept insisting that he had seen the dead body with his own eyes. He gave a description of the old man to the police, but it was clear that they didn't believe him. A few days later, Robert went to the police station and asked if they had come up with any information about the old man. The police officer gave him a strange look and said, "Actually, we did. We checked the property records to see who owned the house. Then we did a little asking around." "That's great," said Robert. "And what did you find?" "Well, there was an old man who used to live in the house. Seemed like he fit your description. He had a wife, too. She disappeared, and nobody heard from her again. Some people suspected he murdered her and buried her in the yard. But there was never any real evidence. Just a lot of loose talk and rumors spread by the locals. Nothing concrete. Until now." "Have you arrested him?" "We'd like to, but there's just one problem." "What's that?" The policeman gave a wry smile and said, "He died in 1963, on Halloween night."
The steeples are white in the wild moonlight, and the trees have a silver glare. Past the chimneys high, see the vampires fly, and the harpies of upper air that flutter and laugh and stare. For the village dead to the moon outspread never shone in the sunset's gleam, but grew out of the deep that the dead years keep, where the rivers of madness stream down the gulfs to a pit of dream. A chill wind weaves through the rows of sheaves in the meadows that shimmer pale, and come to twine where the headstones shine, and the ghouls of the churchyard wail for harvests that fly and fail. Not a breath of the strange grey gods of change that tore from the past its own can quicken this hour, when a spectral power spreads sleep o'er the cosmic throne and looses the vast unknown. So here again stretched the vale and plain that moons long forgotten saw, and the dead leap gay in the pallid ray, sprung out of the tomb's black maw, to shake all the world with awe. And all the morn shall greet forlorn the ugliness and the past of rows where thick rise the stones and brick, and some day be with the rest, and brood with the shades unblessed. Then wild in the dark let the lemurs bark, and the leprous spires ascend, for new and old alike in the fold of horror and death are penned, for the hounds of time to rend.
I grew up on a tiny village up north. It wasn't one of those charming, little picturesque tourist villages. Hardly anybody outside the country knew it existed. I hated it there. It was dull and remote. The closest railway station was an hour away, and the nearest big town was a 2-hour drive. My home life wasn't that great either. My parents could never stand each other. I could never really understand why they got married in the first place. Whenever the accusations and the name-calling got too loud, I would escape to my great Aunt Elsie's house down the street. Great Aunt Elsie wasn't perfect herself, but she was always kind to me. Even as a child, I could sense that she really wasn't a welcome presence in our little community. She almost never had any visitors, and her little fence was always full of rude graffiti, courtesy of the local teenagers. To describe her as a little batty would have been an understatement. Her house was always full of things. The sofa was always full of hand-embroidered pillows. The kitchen table was stacked with colourful china. The cupboards would be full of yarn and scrap fabric, and the hallway would be littered with heaps of books. She collected porcelain animals. They would dot the windows, the little teapot in the living room, the shelves in the kitchen, the top of the medicine cabinet in the loo, and you could find a little frog or two on the piles of books in the hallway. But I loved her anyway, and I have fond memories of sitting at that messy kitchen table after having pushed off a bunch of dish rags off the chair, and she would go about making me a cup of tea and some bread and butter pudding. Great Aunt Elsie always made the best bread and butter pudding. She made sure to brush the top with some egg wash so it would come out perfectly crisp on top and moist on the inside. We would sit in the kitchen exchanging horror stories as the kitchen sky grew darker and the shadows grew bigger. As I mentioned earlier, she was absolutely mad. She would tell me all these horrifying stories about trolls in the mountains, demons in abandoned houses, and witches in the woods. I wasn't an ordinary child either. I would lap them up and repeat them back to my classmates, much to the horror of my teachers. Great Aunt Elsie always made a point to end her stories by taking my hand and saying, "But remember, Carol," she said, her hands warm against mine, "the real monsters are amongst us." I thought she was talking about Mr. Smith, the grumpy old man with a permanent frown on his face who lived across the street. He would scare us, particularly when we would walk by his house, and we could catch him glaring at us from his window. He wasn't particularly friendly towards the adults in our community either. Dad once called him a nasty old bastard when he came over to complain about George playing and barking in our garden in the afternoons. I wondered what kind of monster Mr. Smith was. I won't lie, I loved Great Aunt Elsie's horror stories, but they'd always come back to haunt me in my dreams. I would often have dreams about being chased in the woods by Mr. Smith with a scythe in his hands. I would never tell Great Aunt Elsie about it, though. I didn't want to appear weak. Being related to her wasn't great. As I have mentioned earlier, she wasn't very popular in our little village. My parents never spoke about why, but I would listen to the kids at school repeat what their parents would say at dinner. From what I can remember, Great Aunt Elsie was once married to a plumber with wandering eyes and an alcohol problem. A few years into their marriage, he had his eyes on a pretty young barmaid from the only pub in the village. Great Aunt Elsie thought that having a child might solve this problem. They tried for several months, and finally one morning, she found out that she was pregnant. Her husband was suddenly in love with her again. But the happy times did not last for too long, for she fell down a flight of stairs one morning and lost the baby. That night, her husband was back at the pub, while Great Aunt Elsie cried alone in her hospital bed. Society back then wasn't very kind to women who had lost their husbands, either to illness or beautiful young women. When Great Aunt Elsie tried to get back to living a normal life after she came back home, whispers went around, speculating if her husband was no longer interested in her because she was barren. Eventually, he and the young barmaid disappeared. They had run away together, and Great Aunt Elsie was left to fend for herself. I could never ask my parents about this, but I could see how lonely she was, so I made sure to visit her every day. Besides, my parents didn't care where I was until dinner time. When I turned 18, I decided to pack my bags and head off to the big city. I couldn't stand being in that grim little village. It was so suffocating. So I applied to a university and got out of that hellhole. I would write to Great Aunt Elsie sometimes. She didn't have a telephone, and I doubt she knew what computers were, so I would stick to sending her the occasional postcard. My parents divorced after I left, so I had nowhere to call home. Instead, I looked for a job and settled down in the big city. I got a call from Mum one evening, and she told me that Great Aunt Elsie had a heart attack when she was getting out some bread. They discovered her will, and she had left her house to me. I took the first train the next morning, and before I knew it, I was climbing out of an old rickety bus onto the quiet, dirty road towards Great Aunt Elsie's house. Mum told me about the spare key under the old tattered welcome mat by the front door. Old memories came flooding back as I stepped into the musty old hallway with piles of books everywhere. While the world outside had progressed by centuries, the house stayed still in time. Suddenly, the smell of bread and butter pudding fresh out of the oven hit my nose, and I felt like I was 10 again. Every surface was covered with a thick layer of dust. It looked like Great Aunt Elsie had given up on cleaning in her last days. There were dirty dishes in the sink, and the rubbish bin had flies buzzing about it. There was so much tidying up to do. I walked around the house, trying to take it in. I kept expecting to see her sitting in her favorite chair in the living room, looking through an old cookbook. But she was gone. Great Aunt Elsie was gone, and she was never coming back. I felt guilty as I remembered how I stopped writing to her, except on Christmas and her birthday. I wished I had visited her after I moved out, I noticed the door under the stairs. It was a door to the cellar. I had only been there once, but Great Aunt Elsie got really upset, and she did something that she had never done before. She raised her voice at me. I was frightened. She made me promise her that I would never set a foot in the cellar again. The next day, there was a padlock on the door. In my childish ignorance, that incident was quickly forgotten, and so was the cellar. Now, I was curious. Finding the key was difficult with all the clutter in the house, but I finally found a key in the chest of drawers by her bed. After trying almost all keys, I found one that fit. A wall of dust hit me as I opened the door. I coughed, trying to find a light switch on the wall next to the door. Flicking it on, a dim glow filled the cellar. I made my way down the rickety stairs. It was just as untidy as I remembered. There were boxes piled high all the way to the ceiling, broken furniture, newspapers, dirty towels, and dusty sheets, and all other kinds of rubbish. My eyes stung, and my nose felt like it was on fire. I decided to head upstairs. Just as I was about to turn around, something caught the corner of my eye. There was another doorway behind 2 rows of boxes. I could see a rusty padlock from the gap between the boxes. The boxes were heavy, probably filled with china and more books. I managed to remove them all out of the way. That's strange. Why did she have a separate room in her cellar? I pulled the key ring out of my pocket. On the 7th try, the lock clicked open, and the rusty padlock fell to the floor with a loud clang that almost made me jump out of my skin. I opened the door. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was overwhelmingly musty, like nobody had opened the door in years. I looked down and felt bile rise in my throat. I stepped back and puked on the floor next to me. The room was small, like a closet, and to my horror, there were 2 skeletons slumped against the wall. I could identify them as male and female from their faded, tattered clothing. That's when I noticed something else. There were scratch marks on the inside of the closet door. As a child, I lived with my grandmother in rural northeast Georgia in the early 1960s. One of my favorite pastimes was to explore all the trails I would come across with my dog. Up the hill and through the woods from my grandmother's house, I found an old 2-story house with faded white peeling paint that had been closed up for many years. I was told to not go poking around up there, so of course, that's exactly what I wanted to do. The path through the woods was overgrown and pretty hard to see. The trees were still and quiet, with no bird calls or chattering squirrels as I walked up to the door. It was locked, of course, so I peeked through a dusty window and discovered that I was able to push it up. After climbing in, I saw the house was fully furnished. The windows all had dusty, filmy curtains. The living room was furnished with a sofa, 2 chairs and end tables, and there were doilies on the tables and sofa back. There were also lamps, bookcases, knickknacks, and a small ornate organ near the front door. There were even a few old pictures on the walls. Dust lay thickly on everything. There was a dark, narrow staircase in the living room that went upstairs. The kitchen was right next to the living room, and there I discovered a long wooden table that had 5 place settings laid, along with silverware, bowls, and glasses that still contained the remains of old dried-up food and drink. There were even a couple of pans on the old stove and some dirty dishes still in the sink. About that time, I started feeling prickles on my arms and felt like someone was watching me. I was way too scared to go up the stairs and hurriedly climbed back out through the window. 54 years later, during a Skype visit I was having with my older brother, I told him about the experience I had in the old house, when I noticed he had a funny look on his face. When I asked him what was wrong, he told me he had done the same exact thing years earlier, except he had climbed a tree next to the house and went in through the 2nd-story window. He said that there were 3 bedrooms just as fully furnished as the rooms below, and that the one closet door he opened was full of clothes. He too said he had begun feeling like he was being watched, and that the air felt heavy and he decided he had better get out. We both were amazed at our similar experiences. Although I tried and tried, I was never able to find out what happened to the occupants of that old house. My grandmother would never talk about them. The house was later razed to the ground, and nothing has been built there to this day. I've always wondered what in the world would make a family leave their home in such a hurry that they left in the middle of their meal, abandoned all their possessions, apparently never to return.
I'm looking to get rid of a chair. Perfect condition, only about 6 months old, no damage at all. It's actually a very nice, comfortable office chair. I bought it for about $90, but I think we could make a deal. How's 60 sound? It breaks my heart to get rid of the chair, but I just can't stand to have it in my room a moment longer. I can't move it to another room. Thing is, I live in a very small apartment, and my office and bedroom are essentially the same thing. So even when I move the chair out of the space, it sort of just finds its way back. I'm thinking of lowering the price to $50, if that's a bit more suitable. I just can't shake this feeling whenever it's around me. It sounds pretty silly, I know, but I think of this old superstition that an aunt of mine told me once. She said that if you leave a chair sitting in a room where you sleep at night, something will sit in it and watch you. Now, I don't know what something means, but of course, it's just a ridiculous superstition. I do tend to let my imagination get away from me, though. Maybe my silly imagination is what's been keeping me up at night. But making some extra space in my room shouldn't make everything more comfortable, I think. So, how does 45 sound? The chair is nice, I promise. It supports the spine well, the height adjusts, and the original box said it can easily take up to about 300 pounds. I've piled that chair up with books and boxes and everything I can get my hands on, and it never has an issue. I do think it might be a little off-kilter, though. Perhaps it's just the way I've put it together. The last few nights I've had it, I've put all of my old college textbooks on the seat, but they keep slipping off in the middle of the night. All of them just slide off the end of the seat and onto the floor, leaving the seat empty but oddly indented. So, how does $30 sound? More reasonable? Speaking of off-kilter, there's an issue of the chair turning on its own occasionally, but this may be due to an uneven floor. Once you get it in your home, I'm sure it won't be a problem. Now and then the chair happens to twist itself a little bit to the right or the left, usually stopping once it's directly facing my bed. Now and then it's a full 180, but then again, once it's reassembled, it'll probably be just fine. Darn uneven floors. Well, I'll give it up for $20 if someone wants to just pick it up before this evening. I sincerely hope this chair gets some interest soon. I just really want it out of my house as soon as possible. I have trouble sleeping at night when it's facing me, and even when it's off the corner, I always seem to wake up in the middle of the night to find it right at the side of my bed all over again. Uneven floors, you know. I think all the stress of losing sleep has been giving me some sleep paralysis issues when I do manage to doze off. Now and again, I open my eyes after hearing the chair creak and move, only to find a dark shape occupying the cushion for a few seconds until I blink. When I blink, it's gone. Once, when I close my eyes for an instant, it was standing up a little bit closer to my bedside. Then, it was crouching down. If this happens to you, I suggest closing your eyes and letting them readjust for a few minutes. It'll probably be gone by the time you open them again, and if not, keep them closed. You won't see it if you don't open them, right? Jokes aside, I'm willing to get rid of it for $10, if that's all you can manage. I mean, I'll even have it shipped for free if you like. Really, at this point, I don't mind if I don't make anything off of it. I just don't want to see it here anymore. Please, I really need some sleep. It's been days. I'm not even sure if I'm posting this in the right place, but honestly, all I care is that someone else sees this. Someone needs to buy this chair. Like I said, perfect condition. So, how does a free chair sound?
In the early 1950s, Stalinist KGB researchers kept 5 political dissidents who were deemed by court psychiatrists to have inflexibility of convictions. As they were the nucleus of the Ukrainian anti-communist underground, they were spared the gulags and reserved for special research. Test subjects in the psychiatric ward in Kazan. They were used as part of an infantry combat alertness program, or PNP, kept awake for 15 days using a prototype gas-based stimulant. After being bathed, deloused, and fed a crude last meal, they were placed in a sealed environment, an old bomb shelter modified for scientific observation. The room was reinforced, wired, and sealed so Soviet researchers could carefully monitor the subjects' conditions. The gas, thought to be toxic in very high concentrations, was mixed with pure oxygen to prolong their lives. As this was before closed-circuit cameras, the subjects were monitored with crude microphones and 3 narrow glass portholes drilled into the chamber walls. The prisoners' quarters had been stocked with books, cots without bedding, running water, a single toilet, and enough dried food rations to last all 5 for a month. Everything proceeded as expected for the first 6 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been falsely promised that each would gain their freedom if they submitted to the anti-sleep gas, ate the food, and kept themselves awake for a promised 30 days. All conversations and activities were monitored day and night via shifts of expert scientists. By the 7th day, it was noted that the dissidents began to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their pasts. Day 8 marked a general degradation in the optimism of their conversations. On the 9th morning, scientists heard the patients complaining about their circumstances and the events that led them to where they were. By that evening, they were demonstrating severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternately whispering to the microphones and staring out the one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think that they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 10 days, the first of them started screaming. As though he were in mortal danger, he ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs. He screamed for nearly 3 hours without taking a breath, and without interruption from his comrades. As the night came, he continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional groans. The researchers postulated that he had torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior was how the other captives reacted to it, or rather, the lack thereof. The others continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. Observers of the chamber noted that the rest took books apart and smeared page after page with their own feces, pasting them calmly over the glass portholes. When their task was done, the screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. The chamber went silent. After 3 more days passed, the researchers began checking the microphones hourly to make sure they were working. They felt it impossible that the place could remain silent with 5 people inside. Oxygen consumption indicated that all the prisoners were still alive. In fact, the consumption levels of both the anti-fatigue gas and oxygen matched those of people during strenuous exercise. This worried the researchers immensely. On the morning of the 17th day, furious debate ensued among the researchers as to what to do with the living yet silent subjects. It was decided to offer them a bribe. Using the intercom inside the chamber, they announced, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door, lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of your company his immediate freedom." To the shock of the researchers, one of the subjects responded with a single, whispered phrase. "We no longer want to be free." The room again fell silent. The only sound came from an occasional shift in pressure of the chamber pipes. Debate continued among the researchers and the military advisors funding the research over how to proceed with the experiment. Some thought that it was still worth pursuing, while others refused, fearing the ominous nature of the early results. After continued failure to provoke response from the prisoners, it was decided to open the chamber that evening. At midnight, the chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and oxygen mix, then filled with fresh air. Immediately, voices over the microphones began to object. 3 of the subjects began begging, pleading as if for the sake of loved ones for the gas to be turned back on. These new protests prompted the scientists finally to intervene. They sent an armed retinue to retrieve the test subjects. Naturally, they hoped to prevent compromise of the entire program. At the approach of the soldiers, what sounded like 3 of the prisoners began to scream even louder, while a 4th beat against the walls with some metal-like object. The clang of the metal and concrete created a hideous, almost tribal-like din with the screams. Yet the prisoners were not the only ones the researchers heard scream. Moments later, the embedded microphones detected additional howls, those of the soldiers who cried out at what lay inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although none who saw them could bear to call their state life. The food rations past those marked for day 5 had not been so much as touched. The body of Subject 5 had been torn to pieces. Chunks of his chest and flesh from his thighs seemed to have been stuffed into the drain in the chamber's center, allowing 4 inches of reddish fluid to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of that fluid was blood was never determined. All 4 surviving subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies as well. Examination of the destroyed flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated wounds of self-infliction caused by each victim's own teeth. The abdominal organs below the ribcage of all living subjects had been removed. While the heart, the lungs, and the diaphragm remained in place, the skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been peeled off, thus exposing their moving lungs beneath the ribcage. Stomachs, spleens, livers, and intestines lay fanned out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. Each digestive tract continued to function, macerating food as though intact. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was flesh they had ripped off their dead comrade and eaten over the course of days. Though most of the soldiers were hardened graduates from Moscow's finest training facilities, many refused to return to the chamber or remove the test subjects, who continued to scream to be left in the chamber. This, they said, they could not face. However, threats from their superiors compelled some to return to the victims and remove them. But these, when touched, alternately begged, later demanded that the gas be turned back on. Their reason left many speechless, lest they fall asleep. Though little more than self-dissected ghosts, the test subjects fought fiercely during the removal process. One of the guards died from throat injuries while stooping to hoist a prisoner. Another was gravely injured in the groin and bled out from an iliac artery after being severely bitten. 5 more followed, subsequently committing suicide in the weeks following the incident. During the struggle, one subject's spleen ruptured. He bled out almost immediately. Physicians tried to sedate him, but this proved impossible. Though injected with more than 10 times the safe dose of a morphine derivative, he still resisted, breaking the ribs and one arm of a doctor. Technically, the prisoner bled to death, yet his heart continued to beat for a full 2 minutes after. Long after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail, struggling to attack anyone within reach like an embittered animal. He repeatedly gasped the word "more" over and over, becoming weaker and weaker until he fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords begged for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most severely injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back into his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative that they had given him in preparation for the surgery. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was applied to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through one of the leather restraints on his wrists, even with a 100-kilogram soldier holding him down. It took 4 more times the standard dose of anesthetic to put him under. The instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. The autopsy later showed that his blood had highly toxic levels of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group to start screaming in the beginning of the experiment. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to verbally object to surgery, but he reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when a reluctant surgeon suggested that they attempt an operation without the anesthetic. Over the course of the 6-hour procedure to repair the self-mutilation, the subject never once blinked. He merely stared at intervals at the doctors, a peaceful expression on his taut face. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should be medically impossible for the patient to still be alive. One nurse who assisted the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's twisted mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at his saviors and began to wheeze loudly, struggling to talk. Assuming the prisoner must have something of drastic importance to say, the surgeon instructed an assistant to procure writing materials so the patient could communicate. His message was simple: keep cutting. It was decided the last subject's surgery should be given without anesthetic also, but the surgeon found it impossible to perform his operations since the patient laughed continuously. The decision was made to inject him with a paralytic to prevent his facial muscles from moving. Once paralyzed, he followed the attending doctors with his eyes. In an abnormally short period of time, the paralytic cleared the subject's system. He tried to escape his bonds, motioning with jerks of his head for the stimulant gas that lay beside him. The researchers observing the 3 reconstructive procedures outside the operating room tried to communicate via intercom with the prisoners. The researchers asked why the 3 had injured themselves, why they had eviscerated their abdominal organs and flesh. They asked why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given:
"We must remain awake."
The remaining 2 subjects' restraints were reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber to await determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. But the commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, both stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that at this point, they were extremely desperate to stay awake. The subject that could speak was humming loudly and continuously smiling. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might. First left, then right, then left again as if for something to focus on. This subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for EEG, the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves with the greatest interest. The waves were normal most of the time, but flatlined inexplicably as though the subject was experiencing a cyclical brain death and then strange regeneration. As the researchers focused on the pings and troughs on the paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, one nurse saw his eyes slip shut one final time. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of deep sleep. This was followed by a surge, and then silence from the machine as his heartbeat ceased. As soon as his brainwaves subsided, his seizure began, and he was suddenly spraying blood from every open wound. the only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in with the gas. His brain showed the same flat lines as the recently dead subject. To the horror of those monitoring the EEG, the overseeing military official obliged the last subject, giving the order to seal the chamber with 3 of the scientists inside. One of the now doomed 3 drew a concealed Makarov and shot at the commander through the porthole glass. But the round merely ricocheted, burying itself within the torso of the now dead mute subject. Fearing for their lives, the other 2 researchers lunged for the gun, as if its possession might win either their freedom. Yet neither the woman or the man made it. Each fell, shot dead at point-blank range. The murderous scientist turned and aimed at the last subject. "I won't be locked in here with the gas. I won't die here with you," he shrieked. "What are you? I must know." The subject smiled, pivoting its pale head.
"Have you forgotten so easily?"
It foamed.
"We are you. We are the madness that lurks within your mind, begging to be set free at every moment from your deepest animal consciousness. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven we cannot tread."
The researcher paused, then fired at the subject's exposed chest. The EEG flatlined as it weakly choked out,
"So nearly free."
Between the ages of 2 and 5, my family lived in a house that a family friend was renting out. It was a nice house. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a big kitchen. The whole package deal was for only $250 a month, and that included the utilities. We were told when we moved in that there were only 2 floors, the ground floor and the upstairs floor where the bedrooms were. I remember when we first moved in, and I was exploring the backyard. And as I was exploring the backyard, I had seen a window down at the very bottom of the house. For some reason, it had unnerved me so badly, I immediately burst into tears. Since my parents couldn't get me to explain what had spooked me, they simply took me inside to calm me down. This window was a source of fear and unease for me until we moved out when I was 5. My parents assumed that I would grow out of it, and I did, but not until we moved out. I could never place why it creeped me out so badly, but I avoided that part of the yard like the plague. My most vivid memory of my childhood happened in this house. I had been asleep in bed one night when a strange thump from downstairs woke me up. I've always been a light sleeper, but I fell back to sleep too quickly for the thud to really make any difference. I woke up again to a heavy, awkward breathing in my ear and someone kneeling next to my bed. When I opened my eyes, I saw the pale, thin face of a man peering back at me. I screamed. He booked it, and my parents brushed it off as a nightmare, but let me sleep in their room for the rest of the night. A week later, my 13-year-old sister woke everyone in the house by screaming at the top of her lungs. She claimed that she woke up to a man matching the one I had seen crawling into her bed. She described his breathing exactly as I remembered it, causing me to burst into tears. My parents were not pleased. My sister and I slept in their room. Food disappeared really quickly. Mom always just said that it was having 2 growing children and my dad in the house. Sometimes things would be moved from where we had left them the night before, but that was also brushed off. My sister assumed the house was haunted. My parents assumed she was just being paranoid. For the next couple of years, this continued on. Food disappeared, things were moved, and we occasionally had nightmares about the same strange man. When we tried to convince our parents that we weren't just dreaming, they brushed us off and insisted we were. This obviously caused a lot of tension between my sister and my parents. The night of my sister's 16th birthday came the encounter that brought about the end of our stay there. My sister woke us up again, screaming at the top of her lungs, but it cut out too quickly to be normal. My parents, concerned, went to check on my sister and found a strange man in dirty clothing pinning her down and covering her mouth with his hand. A fight broke out between the man and my dad, but the man was nearly 72 and weak from starvation. It didn't last long, and soon enough the man was subdued and the cops were called. My mom kept my sister and I in the living room while the cops checked the rest of the house for more people and signs of the man breaking in. Instead, they found a door leading into an unfinished basement. When closed, it blended in with the wall enough that unless you knew it was there, you would never see it. We had never even noticed it, and apparently the family friend who owned the house hadn't even known about it. The one little room was full of pictures of my sister and I in the yard, taken from that basement window. The reason I had always been so frightened of that window came to light. The man had been taking photos of my sister and I for years. That first day, I must have seen a flash of some kind, or maybe the man himself. The man was mentally unstable and claimed that he was in love with my sister and that I was their perfect daughter. He also claimed that since my sister was now 16, that she was old enough to give him another child. I'm not certain what happened, but I do think that he was sent to an asylum instead of prison. Out of the many effed up things to happen to me over my life, this one still takes the cake. As a kid, I lived with neglectful parents at best. At worst, Dad would turn his screams and fists on me, but I learned quickly how to dodge the worst of it. Mom wasn't much of a help. She'd just smoke in the kitchen and complain at him for staying out too late. At the same time, we lived basically in the middle of nowhere. Our nearest neighbors were a long walk away for a 6-year-old, and we had trees between us. No one to run to for help. But I was pretty small for a kid my age. I learned I could fit pretty much anywhere. The closet, dryer. I think even once I tucked myself under the futon in such a way I could still get some air, but no one could see me. I was a master at hiding, but it wasn't for a good reason. One night, I chose to do something different. I could hear it in Dad's yells. He was ticked and was about to get violent. Mom wasn't helping either, just piling fuel onto an inferno of flame. So I knew I had to find a good hiding spot. I'd gotten the idea a few days before when I realized the lattice covering the bottom half of the back porch had a hole in it. Not big enough to fit a full-grown man, most likely, but it could fit a skinny 6-year-old, no problem. So, wrapping myself up in my blanket and grabbing my hippo stuffy, I snuck out of my window and ran into the backyard in the middle of autumn when it was 40 degrees out and the temperature was steadily dropping. I crawled under the porch, scraping my elbows and getting splinters in my palms, but I fit inside. It was actually quite spacious compared to most of my hiding spots. I couldn't sit all the way up, but I had plenty of room to spread out my limbs. Of course, I was getting covered in dirt. It had rained a few days ago, so the mud was still a little wet. I wrapped myself in my blankie the best I could and settled in for the night. But soon, even with my blankie and hippo, my teeth were chattering so hard I could barely breathe. I didn't want to go back inside though, knowing if my dad caught me, I'd be in for the whipping of my life. So I had to tough it out. "Honey, are you cold?" That voice was not the voice of my mother, scratchy from all the smoking and screeching she did. It was sweet like honey. I turned over to see the dim outline of a woman lying on her stomach next to me. She had a pretty butterfly necklace and was just as dirty as I was. I nodded, not wondering how she'd been down there without my noticing. The woman belly crawled forward and wrapped her arms around me, and suddenly I became warm, like I was sitting next to a campfire. I snuggled into her arms, not minding the mud. After all, we were both dirty. "You've gotten so big," the woman said, examining my face. "How old are you now, Alex?" 6. How did I know this woman again? I didn't think I did. 6? The woman gasped. "You're all grown up then. I'm so happy." She sighed pleasantly and stroked my hair. I'd never felt so cozy in my life. "What's your name?" I asked. She smiled. I could hear it in her voice. "I'm Lily. What's your favorite thing to do?" I had to think for a second. "I like board games and coloring." Lily chuckled. "Just like me then. Could never get enough of Scrabble. But I guess you're still too young to play that then." I nodded. "Lots of words. I want to play it though. I like the titles. Would you play it with me?" I heard Lily sharply inhale. I don't think I can. Your daddy, he put me under here, and I can't leave. But..." She thought for a second. "Alex, could you do me a favor?" "Of course." This lady was oh so nice. Why wouldn't I do her a favor? "When you wake up in the morning, go to the police station. Ask for an officer by the name of Lowell Joyce. Tell him where to find Lily, okay? Under your back porch. He'll come and he'll get me, okay? And then maybe we can play Scrabble." Yippee! I was all too excited about the possibility of playing Scrabble to notice how Lily's voice caught at the end. I nodded vigorously.
I'll do it. We can be on the same team, right?
Lily softly laughed.
I'll help you understand the rules. Good night, Alex.
When I woke up the next morning, I heard Lily's voice.
Go now. Your dad's gone to work. I'll tell you how to get to the station.
Rubbing my eyes, I crawled out from under the porch and went into the house to grab my shoes and a coat. I shivered in the frosty cold, but I thought Lily was right behind me. After my shoes and coat were on, I started walking. It was long enough to get to the neighbor's house. I really can't remember how long it took me to get to the police station, although I have no idea why no one pulled over to see what the hell a 6-year-old in dirty pajamas was doing, walking alongside the road. Lily kept guiding me onwards.
Wait. Okay, cross the street now. Turn right here. Keep going. You've almost made it.
I nearly collapsed with exhaustion by the time I walked into the station. The guys out front chatting and having a good time didn't see me until I almost made it to the front desk.
Whoa, kid. You okay?
One of the officers knelt down to my level, eyes wide. I nodded.
I'm okay. Can I speak to Lowell Joyce?
I asked. One of the other officers picked me up.
Sure, kid. Sure. Let's just get you someplace warm. Holy crap, your lips are blue.
I remembered quietly scolding the man about watching his language. Crap was a bad word. I was given some warm cocoa and wrapped up in a blanket by the time an old man with a graying mustache sat by me.
Hey, kid. I'm Sheriff Joyce. What's your name?
He asked.
Alex.
I set my cup down and looked at him straight in the eye.
I was told to tell you that Lily is under the back porch. You need to go let her out so we can play Scrabble.
I had never seen a grown man turn pale before. Lots of things blurred together at this point. I remember being taken back to my house, and there were lots of police cars and people around. The back porch was surrounded by yellow tape, and someone was taking a black bag away while my father was in handcuffs. After that, I lived with my grandparents, Sheriff Joyce and his wife. I tried to ask about what happened and who was Lily, but I always got shut down. I was too young to know. But life got better, a lot better. Grandpa was one of the best men I could have ever hoped for in my life. We went out on weekends to the movies, where he let me have the giant soda even though I'd have to pee in the middle of the movie. When I asked if I could drink when I was 13, he let me try a beer. I spat it out and didn't touch it again. He never judged me for my love of art, letting me paint my own bedroom multiple times over the years. I felt safe around him. He never laid a hand on me. My grandmother was amazing too. Over the week, she'd homeschooled me, along with teaching me about things that you wouldn't learn in school, such as how to respect others, but not take their crap. And cooking. Lots of cooking. I could make my own birthday cake by the time I was 12, but I usually just made them for my friends. I got a lot of those after I was free from my dad. When I turned 16, Grandpa took me back to my dad's house. The whole thing had been bulldozed over,
but I could still see the yellow tape wound around a few trees, faded and torn. We sat together on the back of his truck. He opened a beer and drank half of it before setting it down and grabbing me an orange soda. After I drank it, he told me, "Lily was your mother." Good thing he didn't tell me as I was swallowing. I likely would have had it coming out of my nose. "My mom?" I questioned, confused. "Your actual mom. The woman who lived with your dad was not your mother." My granddad grabbed another beer. "Lily was my daughter. I loved her so much. But when you were around 6 months old, she vanished." My stomach dropped. "My dad just imprisoned her under the porch?" I asked, starting to feel sick. Grandpa took a deep breath before setting his unopened beer down. "That's something I've never been able to understand. Lily told you to find me, and that she loved Scrabble?" "Yeah, she kept me warm that night. I probably would have frozen to death if she hadn't been there." I was a stupid kid. Even I knew that. Grandpa went dead quiet before he opened the beer and slammed the whole thing. "Alex, Lily had been dead the whole time she was gone. When we dug her up, she was bones. Experts confirmed it, and your dad confessed to what happened. They'd gotten into a fight, and he threw her down the stairs. She broke her neck." He clenched his fists. "I knew he had something to do with her disappearance, but I never had proof until you walked into my station, covered in dirt, telling me she was under the porch." I was floored. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was shake my head. But I saw her. She was alive. She had this butterfly necklace." I trailed off when Grandpa pulled an evidence baggie from his pocket. There was that butterfly necklace, all right. Rusty, and parts of paint had chipped off, but I remember it as clearly as I remembered Lily's face. Grandpa took a shaky breath as he pressed the bag into my hands. "Lily loved you so much. It's why she stuck around, that bastard. You were her whole world. She was constantly taking pictures and sending them to us in the mail. Sometimes a mother's love can accomplish things that no human can do." My eyes overflowed with tears as I clutched the necklace to my chest. Choking on sobs, I leaned against Grandpa. He held me tight, and I swear I felt a few of his tears land on the top of my head. And for just a brief moment, I swear I felt that warm love I felt that night under the porch. My father was a great cook, by anatomical official. My father was a great cook. Every breakfast, lunch, and dinner, I was always curious on what new dish he would come up with next. However, he had a talent for making delicious food hideously ugly. He used to tell me, "Don't eat with your eyes, son. That's what your mouth is for."
and I'd force myself to uncomfortably dig my fork into the black meat. I never had the heart to tell him, "Your food looks disgusting." While I dreaded its strange appearance, the moment I bit into the leathery slab, I always found myself pleasantly surprised. I remember the black slab well because it was actually one of my favorites. It had a savory taste, and his addition of homemade spices made it even more so. Never was it too tough. It was always cooked at the right temperature and time, crafted in perfection with my father's skill. I remember always wanting more, regardless that I could barely look at it at first. This is what made my father a great cook, and it was impressive that he could make something seemingly so repulsive mouthwatering. It wasn't until I got older that I realized I greatly admired his work. My father's cooking helped me develop an open mind, I suppose, that has greatly impacted me in adulthood. I believe it was something everyone should experience at least once. I was 25 at the time when I asked him if I could have a few of his recipes. I had just become engaged to my wife at the time, and I dreamed of sharing my father's legacy with my future children. To my dismay, he refused. I was disappointed. I didn't understand why. Most families love to pass down their cooking from generation to generation. When I pressed my father further, he shook his head. "I'm sorry, I can't. I promised your grandfather." I didn't know much about my grandfather. He passed away before I was born. Whenever I asked my father about his passing, he would always change the subject. I never understood why he was so secretive, or why he felt like he could never open up to his own family. My mother said she tried to crack him once, but he wouldn't tell her either. I used to believe that the recipes were a way for him to cope with his passing, protecting them and guarding the memory of his father. One night, when my wife was on a business trip, my mother invited me over for dinner. I asked what Dad was cooking, and she said that he was keeping it a surprise. I was eager for that kind of nostalgia, so I hurried over. It was 8:30 p.m. when I arrived, a half hour early. I was starving. I wasn't used to the old eating schedule. We always ate late at my house. When I started living with my wife, that changed. "You eat at 9?" she said in surprise. "When am I supposed to eat?" I said. "We'll eat at 6 from now on." She shook her head. "Sleeping on a full stomach. Gross." When I parked my car, I noticed the lights to my father's shed were on. I thought he must have forgotten to turn them off because he'd been busy cooking in the kitchen by then. His shed was strictly off limits when I was a kid, and even as an adult, I felt like I was being a bit of a rebel going there. I'd never been in the shed before, nor did I ever go against my father's wishes. I was a bit of a goody two-shoes, I suppose. I didn't think much of it when I saw the door ajar, light flickering to the outside. What I heard made me slow my pace. Thunk, crack, squish. Thunk, crack, squish. I reached the door silently and took a peek. My father raised a heavy cleaver above his head and slammed it down on the cutting board, cutting off the head of a dark, leathery monster. Black ooze spilled off the table, dripping to the ground in a puddle. It was when I saw its eyes that I felt nauseated. What looked like hundreds of eyes shifted around, watching every move my father made, and then at me. I ran as fast as I could, hoping my father wouldn't hear the sound of my feet over the heavy thump of his cleaver. When I reached my car and hovered my hand over the door handle, my mother suddenly called from the doorway. "You're here!
Oh, honey, come here. I've missed you so much.
My mother opened her arms for a hug. I stood frozen for a minute, mind racing. Did Mom know? Should I tell her? What would she do if I told her? Where would we go? Who would we tell? What would I do? I let out a shaky breath and acted as if nothing had happened. I gave her a hug and feared she would be able to tell that I was shaking. I felt like I was out of my body, like I wasn't in control. I was on autopilot, asking my mother mundane questions like, "So, how have you been?" and "How's Uncle George?" It wasn't until my father came into the room that I felt myself slip. I never thought much of it before, why he came through the back door. He greeted me and gave me a bear hug, telling me how happy he was to see me. I didn't doubt my father's love, not even once, but I couldn't help but feel a disconnection in that moment. A disconnection I'd never felt before, one that I'd feel forever. How did he get that thing? What was that thing anyway? What else had he been cutting up? My mother and I sat down at the table, and I faked a smile and surprise when he brought out my favorite dish. "I made this special for you," I remember him saying, a smile on his face as he placed the steaming plate in front of me. I stared at it, wondering what I had been eating all of those years. "Don't eat with your eyes, son. That's what your mouth is for," he chuckled. I laughed nervously. "I just can't believe it's been so long." I cut into the black flesh and watched as neither of them seemed to be fazed, including my father. I took a bite, and I couldn't help but picture the eyes moving rapidly and landing on me. The taste, it was exactly as I remembered, but now that I knew from this thing, it didn't have the same effect. The part that disturbed me most was why he kept it all a secret. Was there something bad about eating these things? I could only assume that there were more. I mean, what else was he serving me? I've had deer, I've had bear, I've had it all. I knew that this was something not normal, not like those. I wanted to ask him what the hell I was eating, but I couldn't. I just couldn't. By the end of the meal, I felt sick. I told my mother I was tired and I had a busy day ahead of me. Of course, she offered for me to stay, but I declined her offer, maybe a little too eagerly, giving an excuse that I had to be somewhere early in the city. I just wanted to get out of there. As soon as I left and got on the highway, I vomited on the side of the road. I haven't gone back to my parents' house in 5 years, and I've always made up an excuse as to why. I tried my best to have them over instead and not let my father cook. Unfortunately, I no longer see my father. He's been missing for a month after a hunting trip. My mother is in denial, insisting he's just lost in the forest. But I know the truth. At least, I think I do, but I will never tell her. I miss my father deeply regardless of what happened. I debated on telling the police about what I saw that night, but I don't think it would do any good. Nor would they ever believe me. I just pray that my father didn't suffer, and I never have to see that thing again. soft thump woke Professor Nancy Russell. She nodded off in her office again, grading Lit 101 essays. Blindly, she turned on her desk lamp and was surprised to find a book lying before her. A dictionary of forgotten words. It was from her shelf, an old gift from Professor Gordon in astrophysics, but now with a note protruding like a bookmark. Confused, she opened the book and began reading Gordon's sloppy handwriting. Nancy, you were right. My experiment was too dangerous. But here's what all your cautionary science fiction books missed. When you stop time, you stop light. I accelerated myself so fast that normal time appeared to stop, but the darkness made me think I'd failed. Then I moved my head and understood. In order to see, I'd have to keep moving so that light would hit my retinas. It's a weird, strobing sensation. The trouble is, when I stop... Nancy, you have to warn everyone. You've heard of dark matter. Only about 4% of the universe is normal matter, and the rest is so-called dark matter and dark energy. No one knows what those are. But now I've learned there are things in the dark. Hideous things, and fast, because wherever light goes, darkness is already there. And just like we've been curious about that invisible 96%, they've been wondering about our 4%. Now I'm here. Now they know about us. Shit, got to keep moving. Nancy's eyes flicked down to the open dictionary, where a definition had been hastily circled. Ghoom. To hunt in the dark. Then she gasped as the bulb in her desk lamp popped.
If you ever find the movie called Killian and the Kitty, don't watch it. Destroy it right away. Burn any copy of it that you can find. Whatever happens, don't let anyone see it. My hometown is full of murderers, but until now, they were hiding it pretty well. The place I am speaking of is called Marden, and if you are not from that region, you probably haven't heard of it. The bigger cities around make the news often enough, though. A while ago, people weren't too happy with the political climate of the country. There was a period in which houses and cars were burnt regularly. Bricks would be thrown through local shops. There was a horrible case of kidnapping, and not even the police seemed to be able to do anything against it. Marden never had these problems, though. Nobody here would have dared to revolt like that. It's a beautiful place, small enough to feel safe and be close to your neighbors, but at the same time big enough so you don't ever get bored. We have a great art scene. There are a few town festivals organized all throughout the year, and people seem genuinely happy. Who could have known that it would only take one small movie to bring out a deep-rooted lust for blood in the residents? The movie about which I am speaking is called Killian and the Kitty. It's your typical feel-good animation film. A mouse falls in love with a cat, and through a series of events he tries to win her heart. While the description of the movie sounded rather boring, I always liked going to our local movie theater. It wasn't one of those big cinemas that only show the mainstream stuff, but instead was a cozy little place run by an old couple. You could tell how passionate they were about movies. They didn't even care about the money. They were pretty wealthy too. All they wanted to show the people was the beautiful art of cinematic narration. They spent a lot of time searching for hidden gems, independent productions, and they would screen a new movie each month. Always something really special that nobody had seen before and that you probably wouldn't be able to catch at a different cinema. Killian and the Kitty was one of those monthly specials. My mum asked me to take my little sister Jen, and I was actually positively surprised. It's animated, and the pictures are pretty adorable. While I'm not the biggest fan of these types of movies, this one was different. It just left you with a really warm and happy feeling. So, I was in a pretty good mood when I walked my sister back home after the film. She was so excited about the movie that she didn't stop speaking about it even for a minute. After a while, I just zoned out and mumbled, yeah, every once and then. But then she said something that caught my attention.
And the mountains and the town and the mice were the best. But you know what I didn't get? The humans. They were creepy.
Wait, what do you mean? They were all animals, weren't they?
No, I mean the humans that showed up from time to time. I didn't like those. They looked scary, and why would they be so angry? Killian was so nice the whole time.
I had no idea what she was on about. All of the characters were either animals or plants, and I didn't remember any of them acting angry.
"Hello there,"
we heard our neighbor Mr. Miller say. He was about 60 and lived alone in an old house ever since his wife had passed away a few years ago. I remember being a bit afraid of him when I was younger, but now I didn't understand why. He seemed like a really sweet old man.
"We just saw the new movie about the mouse. Have you seen it?"
my sister exclaimed.
"No, I haven't, but I've heard only good about it."
"Oh, it's really the best,"
she responded.
"Well, I guess I'll have to see it then. You know, actually my niece is coming to visit soon. I might take her to go see it,"
Mr. Miller said.
"Oh, can I come too?" "Jen, you literally just saw it."
I rolled my eyes and smiled at Mr. Miller.
"That would be no trouble at all. Just ask your mum first, all right?"
Later that evening, Jen started acting out as I'd never seen before. She even came to my room and threw a glass against my wall, which shattered all over the floor. I had no idea where this was suddenly coming from. It was the first time that my mum would ever ground her. After my sister went reluctantly to bed, my mother received a really disturbing phone call from one of the other mums of Jen's school, the first of many disturbing events we would witness. Apparently, one of Jen's teachers, Mrs. Perkins, had brutally murdered her husband. Neighbors started hearing screaming from their house this afternoon and ran right over. The couple had never been heard fighting before. They seemed calm and polite all the time, but when the neighbors went to check if everything was okay, they noticed the blood stains on the windows and immediately called the police. She had stabbed him 6 times in the chest and then started rubbing the blood all over their furniture. When the police arrived, they found her sitting next to his corpse, smiling. She didn't even bat an eye as they took her away. The news spread like wildfire. Nothing remotely similar had ever happened in Marden before, and the entire town was shocked. Parents were so scared to send their children to school anymore, and there was a new vibe of mistrust going around. After my mom, who could hardly comprehend it herself, told me the news, there was one thing that made me feel really uncomfortable. I had seen Mrs. Perkins and her husband in the movie theater that afternoon. Jen ran over to chat with her for a while. They both seemed so happy. How did that turn into a murder scene just like that? Little did I know that it was only the beginning. The following weeks, news of horrible events spread around more and more. There had been 2 more murder cases, both domestic. One of them was a man who had filled his house up with gas, killing his wife, children, and himself. It was incredibly tragic, and just like the other cases, it came as a massive surprise. The other one was a woman who killed her senile parents, who came to live with her for a while. Now, we didn't live in a village. There were quite a lot of people in Marden, but we weren't used to all this violence. The murders had been the worst part, but it seemed as if violence had increased in general. I could swear that I noticed bruises on people's arms and faces. Nobody that I knew personally, but still. And while people didn't like to talk about this part, there was also an increased number of suicides. Our safe haven had turned to a scary place in no time. But one thing didn't change. Everyone still went to the movies. It was as if the story of Killian was the only thing making people happy at the moment, and so the couple owning the theater decided to extend the screening time. I'm not sure if everyone ignored it, or if they really didn't notice, but I couldn't get the thought out of my head that all these events had only started when this weird movie started playing. It didn't make any sense. It was just a story about a fucking cartoon mouse, but somehow I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was more to it, especially after what happened at the house of Mr. Miller. My mom asked me to bring over some pie she had made. I rang the bell to Mr. Miller's house, and a little girl opened. "Hello, you must be Mr. Miller's niece," I said to the girl. She nodded. Something about her seemed off. She looked freaked out. "Is he home right now?" Before she could answer, we were both interrupted by loud noises coming from inside the house. It sounded like shouting and crying. "What's going on?" I asked, and almost walked inside the house, but my gut told me to stay outside.
"Uncle Teddy is playing with other kids. I wanted to go too, but it just didn't look like fun. He's mean to them."
Suddenly, I understood why I always felt so weird around Mr. Miller, and how fucking glad I was that my mother didn't let Jen to go to the movies with them. He kept those children that had been kidnapped from the surrounding towns in his basement. For years he'd made sure to feed them and keep them alive. He had been careful, never taken the kids from Marden, and made sure nobody would ever notice any of it. But apparently he must have felt extremely impulsive that day, after seeing Killian and the kitty in the theater. If I had walked over just an hour later, he would have murdered every single kid there. He was already prepared for that. The children were all traumatized, but at least they survived. Still, I can't put into words how disgusted I felt. This was so utterly wrong. Our neighbor, who always seemed so nice, managed to do the most unspeakable things for years without anyone finding out. I kept wondering if there was something about that movie that startled him. Obviously, he was fucked up as they come, but he hadn't killed any of the children. But that day, his need for blood grew so vast that he even forgot or ignored that his own niece was in the house. It still makes me shiver to think of it. The next day, I went over to my buddy Chris and told him about my suspicions. He hadn't seen the movie himself, but thought that I was acting crazy. "How can a movie about some mouse make people suddenly become murderers?" he joked. That day, we decided to go see the movie together, but this time I would take a camera and secretly film it all. That way, we could analyze it afterward. We sat through the whole thing. It was the same happy animation film I remembered. Cute, colorful, and as last time, I left with a warm feeling inside. It almost made me forget all about the shit that had been going on. Chris, on the other hand, was acting really strange afterward. He didn't seem angry or anything, quite the opposite actually. He hardly spoke. He wouldn't look at me, kept drifting off with his thoughts. We initially planned to go to his place and analyze the thing together, but he muttered some excuse and just left. I'm not going to lie, I was a little worried that he would do something, but he lived alone, and I saw him go inside his apartment, so I got home as fast as I could and began to check on the movie I had secretly recorded. I listened to the music, the dialogue, looked at the different characters, but I just didn't understand what could be wrong with this movie. I almost gave up my strange idea that the brutality was connected to Killian, and so I just paused the movie to go and have something to eat. And that's when I started understanding what Jen had been speaking about the first time we saw it. I had pressed pause at a scene that I didn't remember ever seeing. It didn't belong in the movie. It was the picture of a man hanging from his ceiling with a rope around his neck. I automatically pressed play again to get away from that image. How had I not noticed this in the cinema? I swallowed and continued going through all the different frames. There were scenes of a woman stabbing a child, another of a man with a big smile cutting through a woman's throat. These were the milder ones. I don't even want to speak of the other things that I saw. I almost threw up from some of the stuff in there. Those frames, however, were embedded in an entirely subliminal manner, like the speech of Bush, where the word rats appear on the screen for a fraction of a second to create negative associations with gore, I believe. In that ad, you can actually spot it if you pay attention. In the movie, it was so subtle that I still don't understand how Jen was able to catch any of it. I kept staring at the screen in disbelief. Thoughts were racing through my mind. I knew I had to tell the old couple from the cinema. I had to tell everyone. But one particular thought gave me worry the most. Chris. I got up and jumped in my car. I tried calling him the entire time, but he wouldn't pick up. I got to his apartment and kept banging on his door and ringing the bell, but he didn't open. Finally, I got the caretaker to open up. We were just in time to cut the rope and save my friend. The copy of that movie that the old couple of the cinema owned was destroyed. The strangest thing was that they didn't even know who it came from. They were in contact with a person who sent the movie in. He said it was a film student that the movie came from, and that he would like to show them the movie for free if they enjoyed it. As I said, it was a tiny movie theater showing mostly experimental stuff, so this wasn't too uncommon, and the couple didn't ask many questions as a result. They never saw this guy in person. They had a phone number and an address, but it turned out that the latter was fake, and they never managed to reach the number again. I spent the next weeks researching the concept of subliminal priming to the brink. If you haven't heard of it, a subliminal message is the presentation of some form of information that you are not consciously aware of. The concept of subliminal priming revolves around the question of whether these messages could somehow influence you without your knowledge. It's mostly studied in advertisements for obvious reasons. However, most of the information I found on it states that it's not really effective, and the majority of studies proving its effects have been debunked. Apparently, the primes only work under very specific circumstances. Like, if you put a subliminal prime of a can of Coke in a film, it will probably not work. However, it might work if the person is already thirsty, if they were planning on doing the action anyway. In that case, it can enhance something in the mind that has already been present. I'm almost sure there must be more to it, but I feel like that's what the intentions of the movie maker were. I mean, those weren't random people in Marden who suddenly decided to hurt and murder others out of nowhere. They had simply been hiding their urges before, and Killian gave those ones a push who were thirsty for blood already.
I am currently sitting in front of my computer, scared witless. Every moment could be my last. My friend is here with me, and he is the sole reason why my life is in danger. It may not make sense at first, but let me explain. It all started earlier today when a friend of mine burst into my house and slammed the door behind him. His eyes were wide with fear, and he stood there with his back against the door, breathing heavily. I asked him what had happened, and he told me this story. He had been living with his aunt for the past year because his parents were in Mexico. They were doing mission work at a small hospital in southern Mexico. The previous night, a bedraggled man had stumbled through the entrance of the hospital. He was screaming in Spanish and appeared to be out of his mind with terror. They brought him over to a chair and let him sit down. As he caught his breath, he told his story in broken English. He claimed his sister had been killed by something he referred to as La Muerto Blanco. He kept saying that it was coming for him next. Confused, they asked him what a Muerto Blanco was. With a look of unfathomable fear on his face, he said that La Muerto Blanco was the White Death. She is the soul of a girl who died years ago. She died by her own hand, he said, alone and unloved. She hated life so much that she wanted to remove all traces of herself from the earth. So great was her desire to completely obliterate her memory that she returned from the dead as a vengeful spirit, bent on killing all those who knew of her existence. She is a girl, but not a girl, he said. She's not dead, but not really alive. She has cold, black eyes that weep blood. She walks without ever actually seeming to move an inch. She stalks her victims like a wild animal, pursuing them across rivers and valleys, trailing them back to their homes. You are never really aware that she is following you, until you hear her telltale knock upon your door. She knocks once for your skin, which she'll use to patch her own decaying flesh. Twice for your hair, which she'll gnash between her teeth. 3 times for your bones, which she'll fashion into clubs. 4 times for your heart, which she'll tear out of your chest. 5 times for your teeth, which she'll polish and keep in a box. 6 times for your eyes, which she'll pluck out one by one. And 7 times for your soul, which she'll swallow whole. No matter where you go, the White Death will track you down and you will hear her terrible knocking begin on the door. You can try to outrun her, but she's faster than any mortal man. If you flee from your home while she is knocking on your door, she will just follow you wherever you go. The terrified man was certain that this thing had killed his sister. He tried to tell the police about the White Death, but they would not listen, dismissing it as an old wives' tale. Next, he tried to tell his priest, but the priest immediately shut the door of the church in his face and turned him away. The priest had seen the White Death following him, he said, and did not want to get involved. With his head in his hands, the frightened man said that the White Death follows you forever until you tell someone else about it. Then it strikes. It kills you and begins following the person you told. After finishing his tale, the man stole a car from the mission hospital parking lot and vanished into the night. Apparently, my friend's mother and father had immediately called his aunt and told her about the strange man they had encountered. They asked her if she had ever heard of the White Death. She said she had not, and they proceeded to tell her the story that the man had told them. The aunt got a phone call later that night. It was the Mexican police. They told her that the parents had been found dead outside the hospital. They had been torn apart. My friend's aunt had immediately called him at school to break the bad news to him. As he cried, she told him she could not understand what had happened. She recounted the whole story to him, telling him about the strange man who had turned up in the hospital just hours before the parents were found dead. She told him even how the man had given his parents a weird and disturbing story about something called the White Death. When he hung up the phone, he struggled to come to terms with what had happened. It almost didn't seem real to him. When he got home after school, he found the front door of his aunt's house standing open. Inside was a trail of blood leading into the kitchen. There, on the kitchen floor, he found his aunt's dead body. She had been torn limb from limb. He ran out of the house all the way across town, never looking back until he reached my house. As he told me this story, I could hardly believe it. Within the space of a day, his mother, his father, and his aunt had all been murdered. It seemed too far-fetched. But before I could utter a word, my friend and I both recoiled in horror as we heard a knocking begin at my front door. We've been staring at the door for an hour now, neither of us wanting to open it. The knocking is still going on, growing louder and louder. She never gives up. She never quits. La Muerto Blanco is unstoppable. I think she wants to scare us, my friend and I. I think she wants us to blame each other. And I do. I blame my friend. It's all his fault. He should have never have told about her. As I sit here in my house beside my friend, both of us listening to that hideous knocking growing ever louder, I wish a lot of things. I wish she had killed my friend before he reached my house. If he had never been able to tell me about her, I wouldn't be in danger now. I'm sorry I ever met him. And I'm sorry for you too. I'm sorry I've made you read this story. I'm sorry I ever told you about the White Death. Because now that you know about her, she'll be coming for you next.
Her name is Irina. She's a short, tubby kid, the kind you know slobbered over everything. Her white shirt with a large red A is stretched to the seams, and her blue pants are obviously unbuttoned. When I see her, 4 of her fingers were in her mouth. 4 of them. Normal kids suck on 1 finger at a time, but this chicken pot pie needed 4. I sigh to myself and wonder why it had to be her. To catch her attention, I wiggle around just enough to reach the edge of the shelf. Then, after spotting me, she grabs me and runs. I leave the store with Irina, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't anxious. The body I'm in, it's made to be used and abused, and boy, did I expect abuse. That sounds horrible, I know, but I can't really feel anything anyway. It's like I'm covered by a veil that blocks out most sensations. Pretty good for my situation. As she climbs into the car and puts me in her lap, I notice all the apple juice cans, the potato chip crumbs, and what looked suspiciously like a chewed-up pacifier. She'd probably grow tired of me after a while, as toddlers do, and leave me in a toy trunk or something. Honestly, that seems not half bad. I want to leave this brat. Irina takes me home and throws me on her bed. She pets my head, tells me she loves me, then runs off when her father calls. I nap, hoping to find solace from the little monster in my dreams. I want to leave this brat. Irina takes me home and throws me on the bed. She pets my head, tells me she loves me. I nap, hoping to find solace from this little monster in my dreams. When I awake, I feel the pitter-patter of what I can only assume is saliva on my face. At first, I'm royally ticked. Day 1, and already my stuffing is about to grow mildew. But the drops keep coming, one at a time. She's crying. She's sitting on the bed in her dopey A+ shirt and tighty whities, crying all over my clean face. My heart loosens a bit. Dealing with crying children has never been my forte, so I decide to cheer her up the only way I can think of. I flap my wings a little, nod my head, and tell her what she needs to hear.
I love you.
Of course, Irina is terrified at first, but children, they're always so accepting. After working up some childishly ignorant courage, she starts poking me, trying to see if what she heard was real. So to stop that god-awful prodding, I tell her again,
I love you.
The burger bite is elated. She comes at me again, drooling, slobbering, the whole shebang. I'm ticked, but between a crying kid and a slobbering one, I'd take the slobber any day. I begrudgingly let her nuzzle my face, poke my eyes, and squeeze me 1 foot into the grave. At night, Irina puts me on her nightstand next to her scuffed-up bedpost. She tells me to be on the lookout for any intruders, then covers herself completely in her blanket. I find that a little weird, but nothing too crazy. Just the trademark insanity and naivete of childhood, I thought. I try to pass out, but because of the nap, sleep evaded me. I'm left with nothing to do but stare at the pig, breathing slowly and heavily inside her blanket. I'm left with nothing to do but stare at the pig, breathing slowly and heavily inside her blanket. And then I see her father, standing in the doorway, standing so still, staring so intently at the girl. I'm on high alert. Father stands there for a good hour or so, then turns around and shuffles away. I look at Irina and notice she isn't heaving up and down anymore. Instead, she's trembling. Irina knew Daddy was there. Again, my heart softens. Poor little tyke. In my life, I was the same as Irina. I was born from a young mother, unwilling, and subject to unspeakable hurt for 12 years before I finally croaked. This time, I vowed it would be different. This time, I would keep Irina safe. Father returns with a bottle in hand. He downs what's left, then advances towards the bed. When he crosses the moonlight, I see his face has wizened and his hair has grayed. He's old now, frail, and I feel more confident. Irina is whimpering at the sound of Father's footsteps, and I remember exactly why I chose Irina in the store. Then, Father speaks to Irina, murmuring the same sick words he used to whisper in my ears all those years ago.
That's a good girl. Daddy loves you.
My world goes white. I feel myself rushing toward him, entering his body, destroying his innards the same way he destroyed mine. I'm clawing at Father, disemboweling him, and I send him screaming, thrashing, crashing into the floor. He struggles to stand, but of course, I don't let him. I slash at his throat, and for good measure remove the devil's scepter. A few moments more, a few slashes, a few bites later, Father twitches for the last time, and then lays still. I get up slowly and look at my hands. The nails are still worn down from when I used to claw at the bedposts in pain, but this time they're tinted red. I then turn around and face Irina. She's curled up in the corner of the room, looking around but seeing nothing. I sigh and re-enter the stuffed macaw. Using the dregs of my powers, I roll off the nightstand and land at her feet. She picks me up, and I say to her what I never heard, but needed most during my life. Shh. You are safe now. And then I'm free. No more regret chaining me to the world. No more vengeance giving me power. I shine brightly and float upwards, leaving the stuffed macaw once more. But before I go, something compels me to take one last look at Irina. She sees me now, and she's in shock. I smile to let her know it's okay, and float back down. The beef burrito obviously needed some courage to keep going, so I give her some of my memories, filled with just enough hope and strength to prevent her from giving up on life. Then, with one last look, I'm on my way. My name is Irina Fu. My adoptive father died 52 years ago. At this point, I can no longer tell whether this memory is real or something fabricated by my subconscious to protect me. What I do know, though, is that despite the passage of years, I remember these words, these scenes from the eyes of my favorite stuffed macaw, like it was yesterday. And what I do know is that I remember seeing someone who looked like me, but older, floating upwards shortly before the neighbors came over to investigate the ruckus.